that time onwards.
Another very interesting person was a much younger man called Edgar Mares Smith. Mares Smith was mixed race, and he came from a sort of intellectual family. He was a solicitor, and he was the leader of the campaign for a proper celebration of August the 1st, 1888.
Smith admonished those who did not want to identify with their black grandmothers. He said, and I quote, "Let us not be ashamed of our race. Let us understand that the servitude which they experienced was a misfortune to them for which we need not blush."
Mares Smith was a close colleague a little bit later with another well-known name from the African Trinidad community, Mzambo Lazar.
One of the famous Pan-Africanists coming out of Trinidad in this period. He was involved in the 1888 Jubilee celebration of Emancipation. He was an active member of Henry Sylvester Williams's Pan-African Association. He was a member of a variety of other pressure groups in Trinidad. He was very much implicated in the water ads in 1903. I think they tried to put him in jail unsuccessfully. They say he tried to, encourage people to burn down the Red House in 1903.
He was born Emmanuel Lazar, but he took the name Mzambo in order to celebrate his African ancestry.
His name is of great significance to our topic of African consciousness in Trinidad. His name was Mzambo Lazar. He was an African in the 1880s who went back and reclaimed an African name. They say there's nothing new under the sun. Many of us think that all of this started in the 1970s. This is 100 years earlier. Lazar went back and took an African name, Mzambo. And I discovered that that practice was not that unusual. They say that history repeats itself, but it's very fascinating because I can see certain little echoes, even today. Today you have many people who are somewhat uneasy with this fervent celebration of Africanness at Emancipation and want to water it down. And the exact same dynamic was playing out in 1888. The Africans wanted a big thing to celebrate Emancipation. There was no compromise about this being an African thing. The British, they couldn't stop the celebration, but they wanted to water it down. They were saying, okay, don't have any big rallies, don't have any big dinners, let's just have a little church service, but the idea was to try to just dampen it down as much as possible, take this thing out of it. And that was a big fight that took place in 1888. Of course, the African community won out. So there's nothing new under the sun.
50 years after slavery, things seem to be getting worse for Africans rather than better. In 1888, on the 50th anniversary of emancipation, European nations made a mad dash to colonize the continent. They employed bigoted thinkers to generate crazy theories to support their hierarchy of races, with Africans at the bottom. Europeans could then hide their atrocities on the continent behind the notion of a civilizing mission and increase their exploitation of Africans in the Americas. In time, their unscientific conclusions about race would come back to haunt them in the form of Adolf Hitler. When Menelik II beat the Italians in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, it was a portent of things to come. Later, Emperor Haile Selassie seemed to fulfill prophecy. The other sign was the rise of the great Pan-Africanists of the diaspora. The first of these bold defenders of the race was from Trinidad and Tobago.
You have the 20th century literally being ushered in by an incredibly significant Pan-African event, for which Trinidad is at the very center. This is the Pan-African Conference of 1900. This is the first ever Pan-African Conference in history. It takes place in London, England. It is organized by a Trinidadian, Henry Sylvester Williams. He had about 30-odd people, very important people from around the African diaspora there. Sylvester Williams' conference was absolutely important. It became the prototype for many similar conferences over the years. Interestingly enough, Sylvester Williams didn't stop with just having a conference in London. He tried to build a permanent Pan-African association, he called it. And the next year, 1901, He came to Trinidad and to Jamaica. I think he went to Guyana too. He toured the islands, establishing branches of his Pan-African Association. There's a beautiful quotation from his speech at the Prince's Building in 1901.
I love the African race. I am not fighting for the race for my personal benefit. For having obtained the object of my ambition, I could sit down and practice my profession. But I believe that the cause of the people is greater than the cause of the individual.
I believe that people used African consciousness to build a kind of a sense of self, a self-awareness, you know. It was something, it was a kind of an anchor, kind of a psychic anchor. And so for that position of self-confidence, confidence in self, people who promoted African consciousness could then branch out into the wider society, you know, but from a position of confidence. So you find that many of the most important figures, you know, in the wider Trinidad society were people who came from a base of strong African consciousness. Someone like, say, Audrey Jeffers. Audrey Jeffers, you know, the doyen of the Trinidad elite, the black elite for many, many years. Someone who was one of the richest, you know, black people in Trinidad. Someone whose father was the first black person to live in St. Clair. Major contribution was her organization, started in 1921, the Coterie of Social Workers, which was a major influence in the women's movement, in social work. They pioneered school feeding, they did all kinds of things. But Audrey Jeffers, as a young student in England around the First World War, she too was very involved in Pan-African activity. She was a member of something called the African Progress Union, the APU. She was also the member of something else, the Union of Students of African Descent in England. You might be surprised to hear me mention the name of somebody like H.O.B. Wooding in this context. Wooding, who was our Chief Justice for many years, one of our greatest legal luminaries. H.O.B. Wooding in the 1920s in London was a member of the West African Students' Union. Wooding was not only a member, but a very prominent member of the West African Students' Union. They praised him and they actually gave him a ceremonial name. And he crowned it all by marrying a Ghanaian woman. You know, H.O.B. Wooding's wife was Ghanaian. And that's where he met her, in the context of the West African Students' Union. And the point I'm making now is that this self-confidence that African consciousness brought to Africans in Trinidad and elsewhere in the Caribbean, you know, it was an anchor that allowed us then to move. I mean, Wooding is a man who came first in the lower finals, in the whole of the Commonwealth.
The most influential leader of the 20th century was the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey.
Now, outside of the United States, which was the most thoroughly organized Garveyite stronghold in the world, with nearly 800 branches of Garvey's movement, Trinidad and Tobago was number 3 on the list. Trinidad had more branches of Garvey's movement than Garvey's home country of Jamaica. Many of the leading figures in Garvey's organization, even in the United States, were from Trinidad. One of the signatories to one of the greatest documents coming out of Garvey's organization, the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. One of the signatories there was a Trinidadian called C.A. Petioni. Petioni was the man who, more than any other single individual, was responsible for establishing the Trinidad Cooperative Bank, what we call the Penny Bank. In 1919, there was a kind of uprising, you might say, in Trinidad. And the people who led that uprising in Trinidad were the leaders of the Working Men's Association. And they were all in the Garvey movement. These people were leaders. They weren't only in the Garvey movement, they all had executive positions in Garvey's UNIA.
In the 1930s, the outright leader of one of the leading organizations that commemorated emancipation was not only a Garveyite, but a woman.
Elma Francois, she was born in St. Vincent and migrated to Trinidad at around the age of 19. But even in St. Vincent, in her young life, she had already been involved in social movements for change. She had been concerned with the conditions of workers there. And immediately on coming here, she was influenced by Cipriani and his Trinidad Working Men's Association. There was also Jim Barrett. Jim Barrett eventually became her companion and partner. And Jim admits openly that she was the one who interested him in politics. Another thing that was very important about this organization is they can be associated with the formation of at least 4 trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago, some of which still exist today. Jim Barrett was the first President General of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union. That was one union that they contributed to organizing. They also contributed to organizing the Federated Workers Trade Union, the National Union of Government Employees, and those last two unions joined to form what is now called NUG, National Union of Government and Federated Workers. And they were also instrumental in the formation of the predecessor of the PSA, which was the Public Works and Public Service Workers Union. I think this was a very important hallmark of these activists at this time. They did not see any contradiction whatever in their defense of the interests of the descendants of enslaved Africans and the need for the working class of whatever ethnicities in Trinidad and Tobago to come together in their common cause.
In the 1920s, the colonial authorities tried to suppress the celebration of emancipation. They renamed the day.
1927, the colonial government had changed Emancipation Day to Discovery Day, right? So that some lost focus, some Africans lost focus. But in small communities all over the place. I remember my mother taking me to Halon Hall in Belmont on August the 1st to listen to speeches. And this was in the 1950s. I remember going around the bridge in what was Columbus Square, where they had a whole program, climbing of the greasy pole and the beating of the drum. And what people were talking about was emancipation, not discovery.
Despite being beaten to play the drum, you played it. Despite being hung to make a drum, you made it. Oscar Pyle, great pan man, said in an interview, "We take the dustbin and the police put we in jail, and we come out of jail and we take the dustbin again because we had music to make." Do we not recognize that the very invention of the steel band is an act of cultural resistance based on cultural retention?
The African consciousness, which had built up in Trinidad from the end of the 19th century coming into the early 20th century, had reached a point where Trinidadians, individuals, could influence the world.
1957 was the year that Ghana became independent, the first former British territory in West Africa to gain its independence. And Nkrumah was the most powerful, important Pan-Africanist figure on the African continent. And who did Nkrumah, the most powerful, influential, important Pan-Africanist figure on the African continent, bring to be his advisor on African affairs? None other than Trinidadian George Padmore.
Even in the 1960s, voices could be heard calling for a proper commemoration of the emancipation.
George Weeks, he was the strongest advocate of the commemoration of emancipation. In the 60s, it's something that Weeks had always advocated. He never moved to the point of organizing it, but he always advocated it. There was also a man called W.E.B. Lewis. He brought out an emancipation magazine.
The 1960s was a decade of movements for political change worldwide. The Vietnam War was raging, and so too was the peace movement against the war. The women's liberation movement was coming into its own. Africans all around the world were being inspired by what was happening in the independence movements in Africa, with Dedan Kimathi and the Mau Mau in Kenya, with people like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and of course Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. What was happening in Cuba was also of great inspiration as well, with the consolidation of the Cuban Revolution and its victory in the Bay of Pigs. And all this sort of came to us through what was happening in the United States, the civil rights movement, which was that struggle for Africans there to achieve equality.
By the 60s, folks in African America were just tired being beaten and not responding and whatnot. being bitten with police dogs, being washed down the street with water hoses by the fire brigade and so on. And a more militant element was now being introduced, and that became the Black Power element.
Black Power. Black Power spread from the United States all around the African diaspora to places where people were still suffering from the legacy of pseudoscientific racism